I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. I'm in the coffee shop today because the cabin where I typically film is just too cold in these early January temperatures. I'm using this as a bit of a jumping off point to get back into the groove with the I Love Muzzleloading podcast. I'm starting to reach out to some potential interviewees that I'm excited to get on the show, and I'm excited to get back in the groove here. As I've talked about a little bit before, the coffee shop is getting to a more manageable level, I think, where I'm kind of in the groove, and I'm kind of balancing it with the rest of my life and finding little holes here and there where I can get back to muzzleloading. I'm really excited about that. I'm really at the point where I really want to get back into it. I'm feeling really energized about it, and that's what's kind of spurred this video and this podcast episode. It's easy really to think about things like that because it's the new year. It's a time to look at things with new eyes and start planning optimistically for a new year, hoping to get out and shoot more as usual. Whether or not that happens, we'll see. But I've had some things I've been thinking about while I've been working kind of away from muzzleloading that I've wanted to kind of get back into and pose to you at home. And something for us maybe to start a dialogue, start a conversation a little bit heading into the new year about kind of where we're at, how I see things and how you see things. And then kind of looking at both of those data points and then taking into consideration what another year from muzzleloading can look like and what do we want out of it as a community. I'm not coming at you from a leadership position here whatsoever. Just bringing up some of the questions and some of the thoughts that I have had and hoping that kind of the group think, the hive mind of muzzleloading perhaps, can think about this stuff or maybe bring up some other points that need to be thought about going into the new year and seeing what we can do to capitalize on the time that we have this year that could benefit muzzleloading where we can. I think overall, when I'm looking at 2025 or thinking about a new year for us here in muzzleloading and living history, I think that we are absolutely officially through the COVID bump that we saw. As everybody knows, during COVID, huge interest in muzzleloading, huge interest in shooting sports in the outdoors because you could actually go and do that. And I think that gave us an artificial or an inflated sense of where we were as a sport and as a hobby. Not that that's bad. I think it brought a ton of people into it. But I think now we're starting to see people that weren't super into it or people that bounced off of it. They're exiting or have exited. And we're returning, I think, to a more normal space here for muzzleloading. Normal trends, I should say. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. There's still the bump of demand that we've seen through the 2024, early 2025 hunting season, just based on what I've seen on the forums and Facebook groups and the emails that I've gotten. Those seasons still routinely bring in a certain section of people that are looking to extend their season, whether that be modern or traditional. On that note, there's a ton of interest in that space in the traditional side of things. I think modern is the easy onboarding, but still every year I'm getting emails and questions about traditional muzzleloading with regards to extending seasons. So I still think that's good, but it's important for us to remember that no matter how big the bump or how, with the scale of the bump, I guess, across the population, no matter that bump, there are people that are going to hit it and stick with it, and there's going to be people that bounce or slide off. And in thinking about that, coming out of what I call the COVID bump, I think the community and the industry is really returning to normalcy or to routine. And I think that that's good, coming from a place of somebody who doesn't, rely on their livelihood in muzzleloading. I can say that that's good, but, businesses and business owners and workers will feel differently, of course. And I respect their opinions and their thoughts on that as always. But I think that this is a time for us as thinking about things from outreach and from meeting people and engaging newcomers and keeping people in the community. I think this is a time for us to return to that routine and start thinking and start planning, looking at things of, we're going into a new year. We're hoping that economic factors might trend towards improving for people to have more expendable income to maybe try something new like muzzleloading and living history. And what can we do to engage those people where they're at and connect with them, to bring them in and educate where there needs to be education, but also befriend and bring them along to further grow this community, really. In muzzleloading, we talk a lot about kind of the big four: Jeremiah Johnson, the Mountain Men, Last of the Mohicans, and the Patriot. These are historically huge drivers for muzzleloading. And I'm kind of looking at those Hollywood movies in association with the COVID bump as kind of cultural drivers, is how I'm thinking about them. These events drove people towards muzzleloading. I think that the COVID bump and what came out of that for muzzleloading, looking back on it now in 2025, very similar to those bumps and those peaks in interest that we saw with the big four movies out there. I think it's different, though, because of the time frame and the 2020s versus the 1970s. There's a whole lot that has changed. And culturally, they aren't one-to-one by any means, but I'm looking at them as events outside of muzzleloading that drove people to muzzleloading. And I think that the COVID bump is really going to be the same thing as a new movie for the current muzzleloading generation. I've talked about before that I don't think that we can rely on Hollywood to create something that drives people to muzzleloading or piques interest in muzzleloading at the scale that they have in the past. I think that it can still happen. I think that there have been some neat movies that feature muzzleloading and feature the muzzleloading era that pique people's interest, but they aren't necessarily the cultural phenomenon that the big four were. COVID really, and the COVID bump, I think, was that phenomena for, I don't know if it's my generation really, because I grew up with Last of the Mohicans and the Patriot, but maybe the younger generation, the 17 to 25 year olds. I think that the COVID bump was their Patriot or their Last of the Mohicans. If there was going to be a cultural event that happened, I think it was the COVID bump, and we're kind of past that now. And it's time for us to look at things and say, okay, what do we have? What can we do as just people that enjoy muzzleloading enthusiasts, as I call us, event organizers, business owners, club members, association members, however you want to look at that. I see this year as we need to start focusing on what can we do to prepare, hopefully, for that next cultural influx, but also what can we do to prepare to engage people that might be interested in muzzleloading successfully so that we can bring people in without that big cultural event. Because I think historically, what are we looking at, with trends like 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 years before we have another cultural driver, whatever that is, push people into muzzleloading. And I think the responsibility is on us as current muzzleloading enthusiasts to think about that and try to be good stewards as we move forward. And I don't know how we do that, I guess. I don't have a direct plan of action. I think right now, what I'm really excited about seeing is the number of club activities being shared online, whether that's Facebook, whether that's the forums that are out there, the Muzzleloading Forum and the American Long Rifles Forum. We're seeing more online advertising for trade fairs and living history events, which I think is important. There's not necessarily a lot of unification on that practice, and it's difficult for people to find that information. But I think that compared to 15 years ago, compared to, 20 years ago, when I remember being a young person experimenting with the internet, we're in a much better place now than we were then. But I think there's still a lot for us to learn and grow with that. But I'm really excited about the amount of activity that's happening right now, because it means people are thinking about this and people are approaching it and they're getting the word out. It seems like every other week there's somebody new on YouTube that I'm finding that's into muzzleloading, into blackpowder, into living history, that's building a great following with great information and great enthusiasm, which is fantastic. Like, that's awesome. It feels like every other day when I think about that in contrast to the cultural driver that Mark Baker was, we have, I think, a larger mass of people sharing their interest in muzzleloading and living history, helping people onboard into it. And I think that the amount of people now matches kind of the amount of information that's out there now. So, in the 90s, we had Mark Baker, but you didn't necessarily have the vastness of entertainment and information that you do now. So as information entertainment has scaled, not just in muzzleloading, we also have the number of people sharing muzzleloading and sharing living history kind of scaling with that, if that makes sense. And I think that's important. And that could just be conjecture. It feels like that to me, but I spend a lot of time observing, kind of as I call it, that cultural side of things. You can dog on me for being optimistic about it, but I am. And I think that in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have more and more of this figured out as long as we trend in kind of this upward, positive, welcoming movement, if that makes sense. I don't know if we really even need to think about it in this context, but it's how I think about it, and I enjoy sharing it with you because it seems like there's other folks out there that are thinking about it a little bit in this context. I think that more and more leaning into the cultural importance of muzzleloading and living history is really beneficial. It encompasses all of it, whether you're into reenacting or competitive shooting or fun shooting or hunting or building and the artistry of it. Focusing on that kind of cultural umbrella, I think, has been successful. And that's how I'm kind of approaching the future of what I'm doing to try to help muzzleloading. My time is limited now, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things I've seen with the channel in a little bit, but I'm more and more focusing on targeted, super focused, as ironic as that is in this kind of long-winded solo podcast, but I'm focusing on that aspect of things to be very specific and very targeted with that cultural end of things. Now, there's a lot of content that I'm making that fits within that umbrella, ballistics gel tests and things are very palatable to a large group of people that aren't even necessarily interested in muzzleloading except for a couple weeks out of the year. But I think it kind of supplements that greater umbrella, if that makes sense. That's how I'm thinking about it. Let me know how you're thinking about it. Let's have a conversation about this. If you are, a member of a club, you're working on outreach for an event, reach out to me. Let's have some conversations. Let's have some conversations on the podcast and try to share what you're thinking about with other people out there. I think the more we share this information, the more we're public with how we're thinking about it, the greater benefit we have to the whole community at large. Something that you're thinking somebody else on the outside of the country might be thinking, but because they don't know somebody else is thinking about it, they might not see it as valid, which is something that I run into with myself. So think about that. Think about, I guess, in closing for this topic, think about what you're going to do this year in muzzleloading, what kind of events you're going to, kind of competitions you're going to, and think about what you could do to support somebody new at that event. I'm not saying bring along everything that somebody needs to participate in that event free of charge and, bend over backwards. But is it, putting a sign at your loading bench at a club match, saying that you're welcoming to somebody to shoot? Is it demonstrating at a local event? Whether that's, the history of a muzzleloader, kind of muzzleloader, a make of muzzleloader. Is that demonstrating some kind of traditional craft? Is that sharing some education about a local historical figure? Is that opening up your shop maybe to somebody out there that is interested? Is it taking somebody new to the range and letting them try things out? I think it's just something that's important to think about. And I know many of you are already thinking about that and already have, but I present that idea for the folks out there that haven't thought about things like that. Just to see what we can do, what you can personally do to give a hand, have a hand out to bring somebody in, if that makes sense. My words are failing me. I think that's a sign to shift to a different topic here. Thinking about what drives people into muzzleloading, new products, I think, are a huge driver for people, especially somebody who's not into muzzleloading already. As of recording, the shooting hunting outdoor trade show is, I believe, next week. So we have an opportunity here, I think, to see some new muzzleloading products. Now, I don't personally know of anything. I've not been shared. No information has been shared with me. But I think we're poised for some new releases. It's been a few years since we've had something new. And at the SHOT Show, it's really focused on the modern muzzleloading end of things because the big players are there, primarily Traditions, CVA. A few other folks might be there, but typically those are kind of the big two at the SHOT Show. It's been some time since we saw a big release. I think it was in 2019. We had the Paramount Pro from CVA, and the next year, or that same year, we had the Traditions Nitro Fire, which is, been a bit complicated, I think, from the muzzleloading enthusiast level to the state level and regulation and things. But I think the past few years, we haven't seen a whole lot, and I think we're poised to see something, but I don't know. That's just speculation. Many of these companies could be looking at it as, we're through the COVID bump, like we've talked about, because that's something that those companies have mentioned to me, is there's a kind of a rush there of a bunch of people and keeping up with that. And now we're kind of returning to that stasis we talked about on the community side of things. The industry itself is seeing that and feeling that too. Long range muzzleloading continues to be a driver because I think there's space in that vein, not for everybody by any means, but as we've seen out-of-state Western hunting become more and more of a thing, more of its own little industry within the hunting industry, long-range muzzleloading has kind of pushed itself within that. And we have several upper-tier customs being made in that space. So I don't know. I see there being a lot of money in that space for these companies, because those tags are expensive, and with it comes a lot of expenses. And so the expense of a new long-range muzzleloader becomes a little bit diminished compared to everything else, especially with the opportunity of a one-in-a-lifetime hunt. But I really wonder if that space is saturated at this point, because we're starting to see some of these Western states limiting muzzleloading in their states, where they used to be kind of unlimited what you could do, what kind of optic you could put on it, other than caliber, I guess, was the main restriction. I don't think personally that we need a whole lot more in that space. I'm sure there's more money to be made always. Again, I'm not a business developer. I'm not a product development guy in muzzleloading. I do think, though, that it would be neat to see something new in the space, just to kind of kick up some dust to get people looking at muzzleloading again. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, those new product releases only go so far to bring people into the sport. And I think, based on what I've observed, many of the people that get into it because of a new product don't stay. It's kind of a short-term interest before those people are on to the next thing, whether that's another muzzleloader or another rifle or another season or another sport. There's an amount of people that do stay, of course, but I think in years past that I've observed, it's kind of hit and miss, like many things are. I think the big wild card this year is going to be Thompson Center. Speaking about kind of the industry side of things, they've been very public, which has been really interesting. They've been very outwardly personal, which is, I think, new for many of these brands. Greg Ritz is really at the helm, and he's okay and comfortable with being the figurehead for it, which is interesting. It doesn't feel like they're pulling any punches, and they've, as I would kind of put it, they've kind of cut the brakes on their operations, because they are in a way in a race against the clock. Not necessarily that they're going to run out of money, but they're wanting to hit hard, they're wanting to hit fast, and they want to get this up and running and get things spinning, because until they start shipping and selling in mass, there's a lot of money being shoveled into a furnace, I think. Not that it's going into nothing, of course. It's building assets, and it's building inventory, and it's building these relationships to make this stuff happen like a business needs. But they've made a lot of promises that they need to catch up on. And 2025 is a great time to do that. I spoke in my recent muzzleloading news episode that this past hunting season was, ideally for Thompson Center, the last hunting season before there are new Thompson Center arms and muzzleloaders on the shelf and at retailers. And I think that the possibility of that has put possibly CVA, Knight, Traditions on notice that there's a new player in town here, a new old player, maybe a giant is awakened again, I guess, not to make it sound too grandiose there, but there's a lot of brand loyalty and there's a lot of excitement about the idea of Thompson Center coming back. And that team is absolutely leaning into that. And I think that could be an interesting cultural driver for us in muzzleloading and in shooting sports in general. I think it's really neat that a fully American-made company is interested in the possibility of them coming back and hopefully are coming back, as we've seen here. There's a lot of great things along with that. And I think it's important, and I think it's really cool. Ritz is bringing a lot of personality to a brand that we've not seen in a long time, and we don't necessarily see with brands the scale of Thompson Center. And I think he's really smart to capitalize on that and let people engage with the company as they spin things up. While I've not watched every video that they've published, because not everything is related to muzzleloading that they've published, but how active they've been, and just almost every week it feels like punching to say Thompson Center. And I think along with that, they're kind of rewriting the book for what one of these major manufacturers does and is. Thompson Center also wrote the book, I think, for many of these companies, both in their product development, their marketing, and how they operate. Because they were one of the first to scale as large as they did, their models are still influential to muzzleloading today. I mean, your break action muzzleloader, everybody, when you see a break action muzzleloader, everybody thinks of it as a Thompson Center Encore. Whether or not they were the first or the only people to do it or the earliest people to do it, you could argue. But in the end, a lot of times it doesn't matter if you were first, if you're not the one that everybody remembers. And I think it's been interesting to see Ritz and Thompson Center and that team pick that up. Now, the big question along with that and the return of Thompson Center here in 25 is for many of us, are they even going to touch traditional muzzleloading? Greg has told me, and he's told you, if you've listened to the I Love Muzzleloading podcast here, that they have a great interest in doing that, and they hope to do that, and they're planning on doing that. But so far, we've only seen the modern stuff being made. And that makes sense, I think, from a business perspective, because they're focusing on all the interchangeability of parts. Many of their modern centerfire parts are adapted to the muzzleloading end of things. And again, I think that's what made the Thompson Center engineering arm and product development arm so effective before they were purchased by Smith & Wesson, because they just made all of these things that work together that saved costs and just dumped umpteen number of products to market. Getting into the traditional side of things, I think, poses a lot of issues that end of the business isn't dealing with right now, at least outwardly. I think if Thompson Center and Greg Ritz were actively working on a Thompson Center Hawken return, I think we would be seeing it. That's not to say that they won't do it, but I'm just saying that I don't think it's being worked on right now. I think there's an absolute possibility to see it in the future. As we've talked about, 2025 is the 200th anniversary of the opening of the original Hawken shop in St. Louis. It's a big year for muzzleloading history because of Jacob and Samuel Hawken. It's a big year for muzzleloading history because of Jeremiah Johnson and the Thompson Center Hawken, starting in, I think, originally being made in 74, 75, if I'm remembering right. So we have an anniversary of that too. It's the sesquicentennial of the United States. There's a lot of big things happening right now. I just don't know if Thompson Center's focus is on that traditional side of things, or if they're wanting to turn on the money machine that is the return of their likely more popular models. But I do hope that we see that Thompson Center Hawken. Maybe we'll see a look at it this year. I don't know. I try to take people at their word, but I am a little skeptical on the timeline that we could or could not see this Thompson Center Hawken. I think it'd be really cool. I think it'd be great to have another entry-level, quality, American-made traditional side lock muzzleloader. But, I don't know if, apart from the people that grew up with one, how much of a market there is for that now. For 50 years, the Thompson Center Hawken has been talked about as a great beginner muzzleloader, a great starter muzzleloader, because that's what a whole generation started with. But now we have so many more options and so many different options, and the culture has changed so much. The economy has changed so much. I'm working on a short video, I think it's going to be short right now, about the costs of muzzleloading and how expensive muzzleloading is. And an interesting fulcrum I keep coming back to is inflation and how that can distort how we feel about the affordability of muzzleloading, comparing it to the 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Based on the inflation calculators that I've looked at, and I've tried to look at a few to kind of cross-examine things, so I'm not just speaking out my rear end. But based on the inflation calculators I've looked at, a Thompson Center Hawken newly built today, if you charged the same amount of money and only accounted for inflation, would be $1,100 to $1,200. And while I'm not saying that they aren't worth that, I think that that is an important figure to keep in mind when we hear about the Thompson Center Hawkens being purchased for $150, $200, $250. Those were 70s and 80s dollars compared to, 2020s dollars. Getting back to Thompson Center, though, I think it's important for us to remember that it's a different company, a lot of different people, and they're working to honor that history or the history of Thompson Center as much as they can. So far, I think they're doing a good job personally from what I'm seeing. They're building a lot of community interest and building a lot of engagement, and they are kicking up interest in at least the modern end of muzzleloading because people have always heard about the Thompson Center muzzleloaders, or they would like to get one that's made here. I think they're walking that line very well. They need to honor that history, and I have it here in my notes because they could butcher it and ruin that reputation. There's a lot up front right now for the Thompson Center brand in that business, and if it does not go well, it could be very poor, not just for the people in charge now, but the future eventuality of that brand. I think it's almost a miracle of muzzleloading sense that Thompson Center even has this opportunity at all. I think it's great. I'm very excited. But Smith & Wesson dropped the ball, and it's a possibility. There's a lot of factors at play here. But as always, I'm optimistic, and I'm excited to see what they do with it. Speaking here a little bit about, as we're kind of talking about the muzzleloading industry as it stands today and product development here, something that's been really interesting to me is that we saw the appearance and then subsequently the disappearance of the CVA Crossfire, which was CVA's answer to the Nitro Fire. The Crossfire was developed to use the same federal branded fire stick, which holds Hodgdon 888 powder, which a lot of us are pretty sure is just Blackhorn 209. But this year, going into the hunting seasons, there wasn't really a whole lot of branding and marketing around the CVA Crossfire. I think I saw a couple retailers having them on sale for the hunting seasons, but there just wasn't a whole lot of talk about it. And I think that's a big question for us right now. It's very rare that a product gets to market and then disappears. I think it would be nice for somebody to address that at some point. There was that recall early on about a particular run of items and their finish, but we didn't really hear a whole lot more information about that. And I think that's kind of a mystery right now. That would be neat to get some answers to, but it's the kind of thing I don't really want to go and ask about, I guess, because it might be a touchy subject. I don't know. And that leads us into a little bit of discussion about powder and powder manufacturing here. Again, Blackhorn 209 was exorbitantly priced, kind of resting at that $90 for an 8-ounce jug. Again, this year, saw some retailers with it on sale around $75. I think a couple people got cans on clearance for like $50, but still, that's a big pill to swallow. Hodgdon has been pretty quiet about that. Early on, I spoke with a representative from Hodgdon, and he spoke about not being in control of the production facility. That facility's in Canada, and that facility takes on a lot of military contract propellant orders. And so the consumer end of things that Blackhorn 209 is in is kind of low on that totem pole, and then also supply chain issues and raw materials. We haven't heard a whole lot of discussion about that coming out of 2024 and going into 2025. I could be wrong, but that kind of handling of that, kind of a lack of acknowledgement of issues with it, makes me think that this is just where that particular propellant is going to be. And if you don't like it or you don't want to use it, tough nanners, it's $90 a jug, and that's just where it's at. And I'm not saying necessarily that it was hiked up, maliciously as a price gouge. There's still a lot out there that, contracts could have been with the previous owner of Blackhorn 209 or the previous brand that it was bottled under. It still stinks, though. It was a really great powder, and I think its lack of availability is pinching kind of the competitive side of muzzleloading that we are starting to see some really fun things happening with. But it's just kind of all but strangled that end of things. Those hardcore competitive shooters are focused, and they're burning what they have and what they can afford to go out and win medals. But there's no growth potential there in that space without affordable Blackhorn. There's a lot of people shooting Swiss now as an alternative, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But not everybody can get Swiss and have the opportunity to get Swiss at their local sporting goods store because of the ATF regulations around that, as we all know. So I don't know. I thought it was important to touch on. I don't know. It stinks. I just thought it would be important to update and touch on that a little bit. Shifting to, traditional muzzleloading, real muzzleloading, however you want to look at it. In case you missed the muzzleloading news episode that we've done here recently, still no word about Goex and what happened there, and importantly, how that's going to affect the brand and the business going into 2025 here. For those of you that may have missed it, there was an explosion at the Minden plant in October, I believe, of 2024. It's important to mark those timestamps, I think, because there's been some confusion around that on whether or not an explosion happened or if it was an old explosion, and there's been some inaccurate reporting of that. But there was an explosion. Nobody was hurt, very thankfully, but we've not seen or heard any official word about where it was in the pipeline of Goex black powder production, if any equipment could have been damaged, and what that looks like for the rest of the year going into 25 here. This is where I think some of the hangups come for us as consumers and muzzleloading enthusiasts with the Goex association with the Department of Defense, because I think in many ways we can thank our tax dollars a little bit for going to support and help rebuild the Goex black powder plant as an arm of the, as a contractor for the Department of Defense, I believe is the way they put it. But in a situation like this, where a privately held company, we've talked about Thompson Center here a little bit, gives almost weekly updates about what's happening and how things are going, Goex has kind of locked the doors really about this incident, whether that is their decision or the government's decision or even an insurance decision. We don't know. And you can speculate till the cows come home about that. But there just hasn't been anything from Goex about that. I've reached out a few times and I haven't had any answers about that incident specifically. I've had some answers about other things, but there are two things that I've not had a response to, one being the most recent explosion and what that means for the brand and how that will affect production in 2025, and the return of Old Eynsford. We were told that we would see Old Eynsford in Q1 24. That got pushed back to summer 24, and then we've not heard any updates about that. And I think now that is possibly pushed back even further. While I think that Old Eynsford originally built out as a competitor Swiss, a fine, or not a finer, but a better powder for more consistency for target shooters and hunters. I don't know that the demand is there necessarily for that, and the market, that void or that space can kind of be filled by Swiss, which is still regularly imported. I'd really like to see more new production Goex in 2025. I've talked a lot about it, and I've been very optimistic about it. And this stinks, but I'm glad that nobody was hurt. I'm glad that the business, to our knowledge, is still operating and still running. I think it's important, as it always has been, and that's why we've talked about it so much. To imagine a United States where there wasn't any black powder production, that's not something that I want to live through. Maybe my 4 times great grandkids, but times change and things. But it's I would like to see a little more communication about it. It would be nice to hear a statement from them, get some updates about it. But right now, I don't think we're going to. I think we're just kind of left and waiting. Looking at powder availability for 2025, Schutzen and Swiss are still going to be available. Like I've talked about a little bit before, Schutzen Energetics out of Texas that imports the European powder and caps has said that they will be increasing the amount of powder that they import to help fill a gap that could be without Goex being produced or distributed, if that is the case. I've not gotten any concrete numbers about how much more powder is going to be imported, so that's something I think to take into account. But Schutzen and Swiss should be readily available this year through the standard retailers that it has been. With new people coming into muzzleloading, it seems we still have some confusion about the availability of black powder. And there's people returning to it after some time that are finding frustration with it not being available at local retailers. And in case you're one of those people, the reason for that is an ATF rule that it basically boils down to licensing down to the staff at each retailer that is licensed to handle and distribute that powder and sell that powder. And it comes down to safe storage. Black powder, at least in a retail or commercial sense, has to be stored in an external magazine built to the ATF's specifications, a certain distance from buildings and population centers and things, and that makes it can be very difficult for shops to stock that, and it becomes a lot of headache and a lot of paperwork. And that's why many shops have kind of moved away from that, from having it on the shelf, because it's just so complicated to handle that. The best way continues to be to order it from an online retailer. And this incurs a couple extra things like a hazmat fee and a lot of times maybe more expensive shipping fees along with that hazmat fee. I recommend a lot that you get involved with a local muzzleloading club if you can. A lot of times they will safely store powder according to the ATF's regulation and have it available for purchase by club members. This gives you a couple things. It gives you access to somewhat local powder, and it gives you access to a community and a network that's local to you, where you can learn and have fun and get involved. Many muzzleloading clubs also do what they call a group buy, where club members will get in, place an order for powder, so they only incur one hazmat fee for like 20 pounds of powder. So that hazmat fee of 15 or 20 bucks is, and the shipping costs are spread out among 20 pounds of powder instead of one or two. It is not really economically viable to purchase just 1 pound of powder at a time and have it shipped. I think the cost, the last time I checked, ends up being like $70 per pound, which you start getting into Australia levels of expense there, which isn't fun. And I can understand a lot of that hesitation. So if you're new and you're getting started and you're trying to find powder, what I really recommend doing is saving up so that you can purchase like 5 pounds of powder at one time. So you're spreading your hazmat and your shipping across those 5 pounds. When it comes to retailers or online retailers, there's been a lot of issues still with scams and scammers popping up. Any of the actual retailers for Goex, Schutzen, and Swiss will be listed on the Goex, Schutzen, or Swiss websites in their distributor network. If you have any questions about the validity of a retailer saying online that they can ship you powder, especially if there's no hazmat and you can pay with PayPal or Bitcoin, check the distributor network on the powder manufacturer's website to verify that. They're going to direct you to real businesses that can take care of you. Now, because we're in muzzleloading, many of these businesses aren't necessarily internet forward. Some are more than others. But just look at the maps that these companies have set up to find a distributor nearer to you so you can save a little bit on shipping. Or some of the big ones, Powder Valley and Mid-South and Powder Inc., those three are very online forward, and you can sign up for their email list specifically, I believe, about black powder, and they will notify you when they have free shipping or free hazmat weekends going on, which they do quite a bit. Like if I couldn't get powder in person, I would wait for one of these free hazmat, free shipping deals where they eat that cost and get some powder. It's not every month, but it might be once every other month. And going into the hunting seasons in the fall, I know I saw 2 or 3 weekends that were free shipping and free hazmat between those companies. So it's something to remember as you start needing powder. Don't be that guy that orders his new muzzleloader primers and powder on Christmas Eve and expects to have it New Year's Day. Plan ahead and really think about think about it a little bit, and make sure that you're prepared to do whatever you want to do with your muzzleloader safely and effectively. This whole discussion kind of trends into the economic factors that are affecting the muzzleloading industry, the muzzleloading community, and the muzzleloading enthusiast, kind of that tier list. Things aren't fantastic. Things, could be a lot worse. Talking to my grandfathers that lived through the Great Depression, we're very fortunate to live when we do and how we do now. But there are still challenges to people getting interested in muzzleloading. And I get asked a lot about beginner muzzleloaders and what to purchase. And I try to take that into account. I'm very fortunate because I have access to a family lineage of muzzleloading supplies and knowledge, but many of you don't. And saving up for a $400 muzzleloader is a great expense. As we kind of look at increasing costs with economic factors like inflation, increased freight costs of just not only shipping something to you, but getting something to the retailers, I think it really behooves us to engage newcomers to muzzleloading to research, plan, and save. And that's what I would recommend if you are looking at getting into muzzleloading in 2025. Find out what you really want. Spend some time on the forums, spend some time on the Facebook group, spend some time on YouTube, spend some time at your local muzzleloading club or your local living history or muzzleloading event, talking to real people. As silly as that may sound to laugh about, it can be tough to do that. And a lot of times we look cool in muzzleloading, but we can also look intimidating, and that can make it tough for a newcomer to want to engage with us, personally, one-on-one like that. But if you are that newcomer into the sport, wanting to get involved, and maybe you've seen something in 24 and 25, you're like, I'm going to do a muzzleloader. I really encourage you to get some research done first. It doesn't cost hardly anything. The whole world is at your fingertips when it comes to information, and you can't ingest too much. It's hard to. If you ask 10 different muzzleloading enthusiasts what they think, you're going to get 12 different answers. But somewhere in there is going to be a guiding path for you and what you want to do. And by doing that research, you're able to plan, and you're able to then save effectively to get to something that you really want and you actually want. That research leads you into planning, and that planning can help you start to save and pick out the things that you want and acquire them kind of in time, if that makes sense. Just this fall, I was asked by somebody about a good beginner muzzleloader, and I said, well, it's not the best answer, but if you want to buy once, cry once, and not have anything that you have to worry about or tinker with, you can go this route. But it was about twice their current budget. A lot of times, while good, those introductory muzzleloaders can be frustrating, and I've dealt with I've responded to a lot of emails subsequent to that purchase, kind of walking through some of those troubleshooting tips that somebody might have with a beginner to intermediate level muzzleloader. Those things are good to go through because you learn a lot in that process, and it gives you an opportunity to learn from muzzleloading enthusiasts in your area, if there are any, and connect with those people and build relationships in local community. But you can bypass a lot of that headache by being patient and waiting a little bit longer and saving up a little bit longer. It's very easy to get into a hurry and feel this outward pressure, especially online, because you can be exposed to cool muzzleloaders all the time, and you want to be cool like the people with cool muzzleloaders. but being patient and researching, planning, and saving to get the things you really like and that you really want and that you'll really enjoy pays off in the end. You have less frustration, you have less headache, and more time just simply enjoying it. And unfortunately, muzzleloading isn't cool enough, on a grand scale to be available in quality at every corner store, but it is still super available and I think accessible with time and with effort. And I hope that more people in 2025 can engage with that and be interested in that. Those are really some of the bigger points that I had about and thoughts I had about the community and kind of the industry here going into 25. I think we're poised for some excitement. Catherine from Kibler's Long Rifles, in case you missed it, said that the design for the Kibler Hawken is nearly complete. Super excited to see what Hawken they're going with. There's a lot of potential for a lot of new from Kibler with a Hawken that we've not seen them do yet, which would be very interesting. There's a lot that could be the same, but there's a lot that could be very interesting to see. A percussion lock would be pretty cool to see. Half stock would be pretty neat to see. If nothing else, from a kind of a machining and product development nerd side of me, how does somebody with a mind like Kibler approach mass production for those changes? He's got a pipeline built for Flintlock long rifles that, while everyone is different and presents new challenges, of course, there's a pipeline there. And something like a new lock that would have to be very new, some similar internals, but there's a lot of geometry change here. Change of ignition source, and stylistically, the wood I think is very manageable, but the half stock and the under rib, like, you can make one of those, but how do you make several thousand that somebody can assemble on their kitchen table? And I think that's going to be interesting to see come out of that shop this year. I don't know. It's going to be neat. Might have to get one of those. I don't know. It could be kind of cool. I think it probably will be cool. I wanted to take this time and as we kind of get back into the podcast end of things to talk a little bit about some of the back end of I Love Muzzleloading. I know some of you, this isn't going to be interesting at all. I hope that some of you will, because I've got some interesting data points here that I think are kind of cool for muzzleloading, if that makes sense. This isn't meant to be self-congratulatory or anything. I want to share this with you as an act of transparency, if that makes sense, to show you what I'm seeing, and maybe it can help you inform some of the things that you're thinking about with your own channel, your own website, your own club, your own event, that kind of thing. So in 2024, we got 4,800,000 views on YouTube alone. And I'm focusing on YouTube because it's the primary driver. Go from 24 going into 25, and I think beyond. There's some hiccups that I'll talk about here, but by and large, the largest reach that I've been able to get has been on YouTube. The top content in this period, as YouTube puts it, is the top 1, 2, 3, 4. The top 5 are shorts, which I've been hesitant to embrace because I don't like the brain rot that they induce, but I've tried to produce shorts that are informative and entertaining, that engage with muzzleloading to maybe pull people away from some of the other stuff that's out there. The first one being the realest mountain man I've ever seen, which has 1.8 million views on its own. So of that 4.8 million views the entire channel got, one short was 1.8 million of that, which is pretty wild. And then numbers 2 and 3 were shooting a smoothbore, where I load the patch last, which I think was part of that, keeping people interested. Number 4 was Joe shooting a Remington Zouave on the Animalary Woods Walk. And then number 5 are making my flintlock safe after a morning of turkey hunting, which I think a lot of people may have found interesting or puzzling even. After that, numbers 6, 7, and 9 were all projectile tests. both penetration and accuracy. Number 8 was another short where I show a Yazel match flintlock. So I think that has a curiosity aspect to it. And number 10, which I'm very pleased with, is my absolute beginner's guide to shooting a flintlock, coming in with 37,000 views in 2024 alone. I made that in December of 2022, so it's been out now for 2 years. And it being in a number 10 spot, even being that old, I'm really pleased with, because it means that people are still finding it and hopefully finding it useful. A lot of the commentary about that video has been that it's too slow, but I tried to cover as much as I could to answer questions that people might have. Retention rates vary on these, and retention is just how long people are watching. That's something that I'm always trying to work on, and other people in this space I know are trying to work on too. And so I try to have conversations about that to hopefully engage people more with it. And if it's not working, I'm trying to find what is not working, and I'm trying to alleviate it in future videos. And more, that is focusing on the questions that people have, like I've talked about in the past, where I try to make informational things that answer questions that people already have. And the more I get to the point and the more I deep dive into those problems, it seems the better retention and the more value people get out of it. And that's what I'm after. It's kind of a vanity metric anymore, but we gained 17,000 subscribers in 2024. So welcome and thank you, everybody. It's fun to see that go up. Don't get me wrong. A neat statistic in here about the videos end of things are impressions. And impressions are a little bit of a foo-foo number. They don't necessarily mean a whole lot, but I think in this context, it's interesting, because an impression is the number of times one of my videos was on somebody's YouTube screen. And not everybody is ever going to click on a video about me talking about muzzleloading, but I think this proves or shows a marker of how valuable this can be as kind of exposing people to muzzleloading and the opportunity that is there. I love muzzleloading video thumbnails, long-form video thumbnails. Were shown to 21.3 million people. It's a bit of a self-dig because only 4.8 million people chose to watch the video, but the opportunity is there for us to show muzzleloading living history with this many people, and that's pretty cool, I think. That's where the real value of all of this is that opportunity. Now, it's not something that you can chase indefinitely by any means. You can't just shovel money into a furnace for that, because the industry just isn't that big. But that's an interesting statistic. The interesting point of the back end for me looking at 2024 compared to previous years were the audience demographics. And this is where I really had something happen that has not happened ever before for me with muzzleloading and YouTube. YouTube provides age demographics for your viewer base based on the information they put into their YouTube account. So in 2023, 18%, almost 19% of my audience was aged 55 to 64. 13% was 55 to 54. 12.7% were 35 to 44. 16% were 25 to 34. 9% were 18 to 24. And 0.3% were 13 to 17. A demographic, that 13 to 17 demographic has always been looked at as a super important demographic for muzzleloading living history, exposing young people to muzzleloading and an interest to muzzleloading in hopes that they come back to it later. And what we've seen kind of researching this is that, yes, people get interested in it in their early 20s. They have some expendable income. They start trying things out. They have some free time. They start doing things. But then your mid-20s to mid-40s is a bit of a gap because families are starting, work is increasing, responsibility increases, and muzzleloading kind of gets dropped to the back. It's just a cultural shift that happened between my grandfather's generation and my generation. Things have just changed. Muzzleloading isn't necessarily keeping up with the Joneses culturally. A lot of your neighbors don't necessarily do this countrywide. But in 2024, I saw a really neat shift here. And it's the first time that my audience demographics shifted from being predominantly older than 50 to being predominantly younger than 50. And while it's a little self-selecting, because it could just be that older generation finds my videos less and less interesting, but that theory kind of makes sense because that generation is more likely to be very experienced with muzzleloading, and my content is trending more towards the beginners. But in 2024, almost 9% of my audience was over the age of 65, a new demographic compared to 23. 7.4% was aged 55 to 64. 8.3% was 45 to 54. 15.2% was 35 to 44. The largest number so far. 32.9% were aged 25 to 34. 20.6% were 18 to 24. That's up from 9.3. So a twofold increase there. When we get down to the youngest age demographic, 13 to 17 years of age, that number is up to 1.5%. And I'm really excited about that because we're up from 0.3 to 1.5%. Again, not quite double, but almost double, which is neat. Well, we're way more than double. Ethan, you're bad at math. It's up a lot. I can't, it's the end of the day. I can't do math off the top of my head. It's up a lot. And it's a big audience shift. I'll put the graphs on the screen here so that you can see. Big shift. I don't know if I angered, that older generation that was watching or is watching, or if we brought on that many more new people. But I'm excited about that kind of shift, not to lessen the importance of the older guys that we're watching by any means. But if I'm looking at muzzleloading and my goal here is to get more people involved and answer some of those beginner questions, I'm really excited to see that curve shift after 3 years. The first 2 years, the first 3 years were heavily on that older age demographic. To see this kind of move within a single year is huge, I think, for me. And it's really cool to have the data to look at this. I wanted to share that with you. Let me know your thoughts about it. Am I trending in the wrong direction? Is it bad? I'm hopeful that it's not. I'm hopeful, ideally, and I don't want to, you can only interpret so much just from this data. Everybody has a ton of different reasons to do something. My hope is this means that the videos and the information are resonating with a group of people that will end up being the next generation of muzzleloading enthusiasts, so we can hand off this torch and it can continue for another generation and future generations, as I talk about probably too much. Getting this kind of trend line, I think, is really cool. And I'm going to reach out to some of my friends that have muzzleloading YouTube channels and see if we can compare. Because I'd like to see what is happening. It would be really interesting if this was happening to other channels out there. I don't know that it is. But it would be cool to see. In 2024 as well, we saw an increase of female watchers, which is neat. After being 99% male for several years now, we're up to 94.6% male and 4.7% female watchers, which is cool. My mother beat many a man at muzzleloading match competitions who didn't think she could, which I think is always a fun story I liked. The last thing here on kind of the channel back end I think is important is how viewers find the videos. Because if you don't know how people are finding them, how can you get them in front of people? So 46% of viewers found I Love Muzzleloading videos through YouTube's browse features, which means that they were searching for something related to muzzleloading that we had a video about or a video adjacent to, which is good for me to know. It means that we have topical topics, we have topical information, and people are able to find it. Suggested videos made up 20.9% of views, which means that whether through my channel or another channel, the end screen that YouTube has or the little sidebar that YouTube has to show you another video, that's how people are finding. So our videos are ranking well enough and being enjoyed well enough, according to YouTube's data, to be shared with other people and exposed to more people. YouTube search specifically is making up 15.2% of that traffic. And this is where we get interesting here. The fourth number down here is external, which means people are coming to the videos from outside of YouTube. And that makes that social media, email, ilovemuzzleloading.com, people texting the video links is a surprising amount of the data. Now, I don't see who texts and who does that, but I do see things like Verizon SMS. That's what that comes into as one of those external factors for me. So I can see that a fairly large amount of people are texting video links around and other people are watching them, which I think is cool. It's not something that I do, so I didn't really consider it. But for me, I kind of lean that into, does my thumbnail look good on my computer where I watch? Does it look good on a TV where a lot more people are watching now? And does it look good on a text screen where somebody might be getting texted it? So there's a lot for me to kind of consider with that as I'm planning that stuff out to try to make it better. And then channel pages make up 3.2%. This is where people are finding either the channel page of I Love Muzzleloading or I Love Muzzleloading is linked in our friends' channel pages where they're recommending I Love Muzzleloading as another muzzleloading or antique arms channel. And then other is made up of 5.9%. And this is a lot of other stuff that YouTube has kind of aggregated. I hope that gives you some insight a little bit into some of the back end and some of how I'm looking at this. It's not a moneymaker. We do run some YouTube ads. It pays for some travel. It pays for some supplies. It's not sustainable to pay for everything. If I know that there's a little money in there for me to go try a bullet or try some powder, or mostly what I do is buy neat stuff from artists and craftspeople and businesses to try to kind of give back, table rent, table fees, gas, hotels to get to things to cover them. That's where that goes. A portion of it does go to help the family. It is, I think the IRS deems it as income. So thank you. That's all I can say. We've bought food, we've bought some diapers, we bought wipes. It is supporting, so thank you. There are some challenges. We've talked about a lot of good here that being on YouTube has done, and I think a lot of conversations that it started that have been good. Kit building this year is looking a little funky. Last year, YouTube changed their firearms policy, and muzzleloader kit building is looked at the same as building an illegal firearm. I don't make the rules. It stinks. They're a private company. The courts have ruled that they can enforce what they want in that regard. It does not matter, unfortunately, that muzzleloaders are not classified by firearms by the federal government. The way YouTube looks at it, according to my research, is that the United States is one entity. They serve people in all the states. So there are some states where muzzleloaders are more regulated than others. And then YouTube serves a global clientele. So from their perspective, a kit building video can be viewed in a country where it can be illegal to build a muzzleloader, and they don't want to be held liable for that information being there. So they are restricting those videos on YouTube, making them impossible to find or just outright removing them, which is a huge bummer. It is kind of whack-a-mole right now. They've taken down a few of mine. They've taken out about a bunch of others. well, I would like to see personally, not that it matters to them, but I would like to see region locking for this stuff, because I would rather it get seen by some people than nobody. And in a space where it is legal, like the United States, I think that the video should be available to be viewed and locked out of spaces where it's not supposed to be viewed. Or it is illegal to do that action, because it's not necessarily illegal to view it being done, but it's a mess. To me, the region locking would look or work a lot like the ad restrictions, because I tell YouTube that everything I upload has to do with firearms, and they then assign that and look at it if it can be advertised on or not, which isn't a huge deal. Like I said, the money side of this, I do other things to support the family primarily. This helps, but I do other things to make up the larger aspect of that. But YouTube will analyze the content automatically, computationally, and then decide if advertisers want to run against it, and if it meets so many mysterious criteria that puts it in a lump that most advertisers don't want to advertise with it or alongside it, then it is restricted. And then, YouTube says it doesn't restrict the views or the reach of it, but YouTube's goal is to make money by selling the ads. So, how much can you trust them? I don't know. I just focus on muzzleloading. And so that's a little bit of that back end if you're unfamiliar with that. I would really like to see some changes made in that space, but because, again, culturally, where we're at now, muzzleloading and firearms in general aren't necessarily looked at favorably by the people that run these systems. There's not going to be a lot of time given and not a lot of money spent in paying people to spend time to update these things so that they might be beneficial to us. And that's where it circles back to what we talked about at the beginning, not planned at all, but it's important for us as community members and enthusiasts to look at these things, look at the culture we're in, look at the parameters, look at the world, the real actual world we live in, and see what we can do to enact the change and keep the traditions going that we want to see going. That's it, really, I guess. That kind of sums it up. I hope this was interesting for you. I hope it was informative. If you have questions, reach out and let me know, because it's going to be asked. I made less than $5,000 on YouTube last year. I'll just be upfront about it. Less than $5,000. It's where it's at. That's what almost weekly uploads in the muzzleloading firearms space. That's that return. So, in case there's any questions about that, this is where we're at. I think the muzzleloading community is poised for some good stuff in 2025. I'm excited about what I've got planned here for 2025. Things are going to look a little bit different because things are changing. I've got another baby on the way. We're less than 3 months now at the time of recording. Super excited. And my daughter's getting older. She's already enjoyed plinking around with the air rifle. So I'm hoping to keep that going. We spend a lot of time outside. Spend a lot of time at the coffee shop with the people here. Really great community here, and very blessed, very fortunate that we had the opportunity to step in when we did. I hope that you can find a similar community where you're at and become involved and engaged and active. As tough as things might seem sometimes, there are really, really, really good people out there, and I hope that you can find them like we have here. That's probably a little too deep, but that's all I've got. If you have questions, comments, concerns, let me know. leave them in the show notes, in the video description, or shoot me an email, ilovemuzzleloading@gmail.com. If you want to have a public discussion about this, let me know, and we'll schedule a time to get it on the podcast so that we can start going through some of this stuff and keep having these conversations to hopefully keep muzzleloading and living history going, an appreciation for the muzzleloading era, I should say, going for future generations. Once again, I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.